One of the biggest challenges in fly fishing is knowing what fly to use and when. How are you supposed to know what a fish wants to eat on any given day? Well, a lot of that depends on when and where you're fishing because different bugs are active at different times of the year. But there's one fly that'll catch fish year round, from the middle of winter to the height of summer, and that'd be the midge. This week on Untangled, you're going to learn all about this important aquatic insect. From what it looks like and its life cycle to the best ways to fish them, you're going to end this show ready and able to make the most of midges. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. You know, I think that midges are probably the most underutilized fly in our fly boxes, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself because we get so caught up in matching the seasonal hatches that are going on, whether it's our drakes or our PMDs or it's stonefly season or it's hopper season. We get really excited about matching those bugs that we just forget about the midge. And you know, they're tiny, they don't take up a whole lot of room in the fly box, so it's easy to just gloss over them and move on to the next bug. But one thing that we overlook is midges are the most abundant, widely available aquatic insect in the world. You're going to find more of them in rivers than you will caddis, mayflies, stoneflies. They're just that abundant. And I've even read some places where they account for up to 50% of a fish's diet in some fisheries. So they really are hugely important, yet I think we overlook their importance. So we're going to be talking a lot about midges today, how to take advantage of them. But before we dive too far into the weeds on midges, I just want to make sure y'all are aware of what we've got coming up in the Q&A section of the show this week. Because we had a listener write in and ask about how to get in on those hatches that make the river come alive, where every fish is looking up and all you've got to do is get a halfway decent drift and you're going to be into beautiful, big, hungry trout on dry flies for hours. Those hatches that are unforgettable, that we write stories about, that we write, I don't know if we've written songs about them, but if we were a songwriting people, dadgummit, we'd write a song about them. Those hatches, right? How do you get in on those? So I'm going to share some tips and experiences around getting in on a hatch like that that's really unforgettable. And again, that's coming up in the Q&A section of the show today, so stay tuned for that. But let's focus back on the star of the show this week, which is the midge. Now, midges are one of your main groups of aquatic insects that form the backbone of a fish's diet alongside your caddisflies, your mayflies, and your stoneflies. You've got your scuds, your sow bugs, terrestrial insects as well. But those four groups of aquatic insects, they really make up the bulk of a trout's diet, especially in a river. But there's a couple of things that separate midges from that group because the aquatic insects all share a lot in common. Their life cycle primarily happens in the water. They all emerge out of the water to become adults, and then they return to the water to lay their eggs. But the midges are just a little bit different from your caddis, your stoneflies, and your mayflies. Because first off, your midges are going to be active the entire year. They're the only aquatic insect that's going to hatch in the winter. So that's why they're the year-round bug. They will actually complete a full life cycle in the winter. No other aquatic insect is going to do that. Your mayflies, they really peak from spring through midsummer, and then they have another peak in fall. That's when they're the most active and they're the most available to fish. Your caddis and your stoneflies, they're the star of the show. Come summer, that's when they really come into their own and we start to focus on them. And then midges, they're just kind of like my dad jokes, right? They're reliable, even if they're not always satisfying. they're just always there, and you can't get away from them. And trust me, I understand that learning the timing of hatches really feels like an Olympic-sized hurdle, and it can be a lot to remember. And I know I just glossed over a lot of it. I just kind of ran through when certain bugs are active, and some of y'all might be like, Durant, slow down. I need to know when these bugs are the most active. I got to learn more about this topic. Well, if that describes you, then we've actually got an in-depth year-round hatch chart that goes into detail on when these bugs are active, where they are, so you know roughly where in the country to find them. And all of that's in our year-round hatch chart. It's completely free. There's a link for it in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. So that's got all that info in it. You don't have to commit it to memory. Go grab that if you need some extra help, but we're going to keep moving on with midges. So all you really need to remember about midges is that they hatch year round, at least from, when they're active. Okay, they hatch year round. So that separates them from the rest of the bugs. The other thing that is going to help them stand out from all the rest of them is their size, because on average, midges are going to be the smallest aquatic insect that you're consistently fishing. There is one type of mayfly that does get a little bit smaller. That's the trico. That's Alex's favorite fly. If you ever run into Alex, which we've been meeting a lot of folks out on the river this summer, actually, it's been kind of fun to see you guys out in the wild. So don't ever be afraid to come up and say hi. Don't hesitate. It's nice to meet y'all. But if you ever run into Alex out on the river or whatever, just ask him if the trico fishing's going well, and he'll have nothing but smiles for you. He loves them so much. Oh, well, anyways, tricos can be pretty small. And they can generally be a lot smaller than midges. But a lot of the midge adults that I fish consistently are sizes 20 to 24. So they're pretty small. I've even got some size 28 midge patterns in my box, believe it or not. A good buddy of mine, he really got into small flies for a while. I think he still is. But he got me hooked on them for a bit too, with 8 and 9X tippet and 28s and 30s. And even I found some size 32 dry fly hooks tied up 32s. It was absolute insanity. And I can't find them anymore. I think they only still sell them in Japan, and I can't get them here in the US anymore. Anyways, getting completely off topic here. Midges are small. That's they're small and they hatch year round. That's what I want you guys to remember. So let's go ahead and look at their life cycle. Okay. Just like every other aquatic insect, midges are going to start their lives out as an egg that got laid on the bottom of the river. And then once they hatch, the midges are in their larval phase. At this point, they're going to look like tiny little worms, maybe, I don't know, a couple, like 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4 inch long, maybe a little bit longer than that. They just kind of drift along with the current when they're in this stage too. So they're really easy pickings for hungry fish, whether it's trout or bass. They're going to see midges go by and they're going to gobble them up pretty quickly. Now, once they've grown up a little bit, they've had a chance to mature, as it were. Those larvae turn into pupa now. They've put on a little bit of weight, so they're a little stockier than they were as a larva. And this is when they start working their way towards the surface so that they can hatch into an adult. If you've ever seen any midge patterns labeled midge emergers, this is the life cycle stage that they're imitating. The point when the midges are ready to graduate high school and they're going to go out into the real world, and they're going to realize that they had it so good back then when they didn't have any responsibilities, they didn't have any jobs, they didn't have any insurance payments. It was just easy. And they're going to long for those days, and they're going to want to go back to them. But they can't, because it's a cruel world that we live in, and the midges live in it too. Anyways, these midge pupa, they're going to move up to the surface, and they're actually going to shed their nymphal shuck. So they kind of like a butterfly shedding out of its cocoon. They do the same thing. They shed that shuck, and then they hatch into the full-grown midge adult. And at this point, they'll usually cluster together on the water surface for a few minutes. And when the midge hatches get really thick, when they're just really going, they'll cluster. There'll be so many clustered together that they'll look like chunks of carpet floating down the river almost. It's been really cool to see a midge hatch that thick. And then once they're ready once they've dried their wings off, they're ready. They're going to fly away from the water. They're going to mate, and then they return to the river to lay their eggs and die. And that completes the whole life cycle of the midge. As an adult, the midges look an awful lot like a mosquito, so you might see them at first and get really angry, like I do. but they don't bite. So that's the best part. The midges are friendly. They're not here to ruin your day like the mosquitoes or the stinking biting deer flies. Oh my, those were the bane of our existence last week. Alex and I were out getting some content, and we're still, I think, scratching ourselves from all those deer fly bites. But they've got the same legs and the short, stocky body that a lot of mosquitoes do. So they're going to look a lot like that, but the midges don't have a tail. All right. They're often going to be black or dark brown in color. And then again, they're very small. Some varieties of midges can be quite a bit larger, closer to like a size 16 or even a 14 in some places, but 18 to 22 is probably the most common size range for a lot of your midge adults, especially in rivers. Midges are going to be most active in your low light conditions. So early mornings and late evenings are going to be the best time to get in on a midge hatch. But I've been in midge hatches when the sun was really high in the sky. Even last week, there were midges coming off in the middle of the day for whatever reason. And especially during the winter, you'll find the midges are going to come off at the warmest part of the day, which usually tends to be about 2 to 3 in the afternoon, which is getting, winter time. You're getting towards that low light hour, but usually they'll be most active when the water's warmest in the winter. As far as fishing a midge hatch, you're going to fish it just like you would any other hatch. You're going to watch and wait to see what the fish are eating, and then you're going to tie a fly on to match that bug. Where I think midges are overlooked and underutilized, especially since I said at the start of the show that they make up 50% of the diet for fish in some fisheries, is right now. Is actually this late summer timeline is when I think midges get the most overlooked. Because if you're going out in the middle of winter, it's a very safe bet to put midge nymphs on. And then if you see a hatch happening, it's going to be midges. So you put some midge adults on and you just go through it. Same thing in the early spring before the blue-winged olives make their first appearance. Before those mayflies come off, it's going to be midges. Okay, but right now at this point in time, I think midges get overlooked the most, and the reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, Alex and I were out on the river last week. We were getting some content, and I think it was like 5 or 6 p.m. So we still had about 4 hours of daylight left when we showed up. And we got to this one piece of river and we saw some fish rising and I saw some bugs buzzing on the water surface. And because of how small they were and the time of year that it is, I assumed that they were trichos, those tiny mayflies that come off usually about this time of year. And I even had a mayfly rig tied on. So I reckoned I was going to be into fish just fine. I didn't need to tweak anything. And then once I started fishing, I saw some caddis buzzing around as well. So I thought, oh sweet, we got trichos, we got caddis. I'm gonna be into fish no matter what. I feel very confident about this. Well, it turns out once I actually got down to the river and actually looked at what was going on, those things that I thought were trichos were actually midges, and the fish were keyed in on them instead of the caddis. There were caddis bouncing all over the water. There were caddis emerging up out of the water. So you had both things going on at once, and the fish were ignoring the caddis and eating the midges in the middle of July, which really is kind of odd because you would think they'd take advantage of the bigger, easier bug to get, which is the caddis. But if there's 3 caddis or like 50 midges, what are they going to go for? They're probably going to go for the one that's the most abundant, that's the easiest for them to get to. And if there's more midges, stands to reason it's probably a little bit easier to get to them. And so anyways, to wrap it up, the best fish I caught that whole afternoon was on a nymph that really could pass for a midge pupa. And I didn't get anything on the mayfly imitations or on the caddis imitations. It was all on the stuff that looked the most like midges. So that's one reason why I think they're just overlooked, because if I hadn't been paying attention, I probably would have just assumed they were trichos and really tried to fish that. And I might have caught a couple, because trichos and midges are similar enough in size and shape that if the fish aren't being terribly picky, you can catch them on either one. But then again, I might have had my butt kicked too. You never know. So that's one reason, again, why I think midges just get overlooked, because they are active year round, and I don't know. I personally don't fish them as much as I probably should. And I don't think a lot of other anglers do either. And then there's another story, just to drive this point home. I've told this on the show a few times, so if you're a long-time listener, I apologize. But last spring, Alex and I were out in Montana, and we were on the Beaverhead River, and it was really early spring. There was still like 3 feet of snow on the ground, and we pulled up to the Beaverhead one morning. Beautiful day, bright and sunny, and we thought, oh, sweet, we're going to be into this blue wing hatch. And sure enough, we park the truck, get out, and I see a fish rise and a blue wing float past me almost as soon as we're out of the truck. So I think we're into it, and we are golden. So without even looking at anything else, I just tie on a mayfly rig, go out there and start fishing. And I get my butt kicked for like an hour. The fish are rising, they're going nuts, and they're ignoring all of my mayfly stuff. So I finally set everything down, and I watch and wait. I do the thing that I preach that we should all do, but I don't do enough myself either. And lo and behold, there's a whole bunch of midges hatching along with those blue-winged olives, and the fish were actually eating the midges. They were ignoring the bigger bug and going nuts on the midges. So I switched over to a midge rig, and boom, we got into fish. So the midges can really be something the fish key in on, just depending on their mood. Sometimes I really think that's why they do it. They're in the mood for it that day. So moral of those two stories: don't overlook midges, no matter what you're doing. And if the fish aren't actively rising, if you get to the river, you don't see any bugs moving either. There just doesn't feel like much is going on. It is never a bad idea to tie on a midge nymph onto your dry dropper rig or your nymph rig and work through the water with some midge patterns. I'll fish zebra midges, which is a midge nymph pattern. I'll fish those things year round. And again, I'll do very well with zebra midges middle of July when a lot bigger flies are available. In fact, one of my most effective dry dropper rigs on a lot of my favorite streams right now is a caddis up top with a midge underneath it, a zebra midge underneath it. So it really can be an effective way to fish year round. Now, speaking of patterns, let's get into a few of the ones that I recommend you keep in your box year round so that you are prepared for any midge hatch that you might run into. To imitate your larva and your pupa, we're going to lump them together. I always have some zebra midges on hand in sizes 16 to 22, and I like them in black, red, and olive. They imitate that larva stage where they look like the tiny little worms. Zebra midges are really easy to tie. They're super simple. They're relatively durable, and they just catch fish. They really are. We talk about this all the time. There's no such thing as a silver bullet fly in fly fishing, a fly that works 24/7, 365, because even though midges are active year round, some days the fish aren't. They're just not going to want to eat them. Some days it's just not going to put a fish in the net. Some days you've got to go to that squirmy worm or that mop fly or whatever it is to put fish in the net. But if I had to pick one that got really close to that magic fly, it would probably be the zebra midge. They are just crazy effective, at least from the nymph, in the nymph world. So I really love the zebra midge, again, in black, red, and olive, and I like that in sizes 16 to 22. The demon midge is another fantastic larva. This one also looks more like a pupa because they're a little bit longer. And this is a VFC pattern. We have these in a size 16. And I think there's still some available in our 3-packs on the website, so you can go check those out if you're interested. I'll throw a link in the show notes for y'all to take a look at those. But demon midge is just a red version of those midges, just a little bit longer. Really does a good job, again, imitating both the larva and the pupa. And then rainbow warriors and WD-40s in sizes 16 to 18 are also very effective at this point. The WD-40 is kind of sneaky good. I've been fishing it a lot more lately than I have, and I love it because it's got such a slim profile, but it sinks very quickly, but It's just the right size and shape that it'll pass as a mayfly nymph sometimes, but it's a really, really good midge nymph. So definitely have that on hand. And then the rainbow warrior, that's just a very bright, flashy attractor pattern. It's designed to grab the attention of fish. Works very well in stained water, or if the fish are highly pressured and there's a lot of people throwing very technical, very lifelike flies at them. Sometimes you throw something that's a little different, that's really flashy, but still the right size and shape. Sometimes that will be the ticket that gets the fish to go ahead and eat. So the rainbow warrior is a great one to have. As far as the emergers go, I like an RS2 in sizes 16 to 20. You can fish this right up top. You can put some floating on it and fish it right in the surface film if you want. You can leave it without floating and just let it sink a few inches below the surface and fish it on the end of a dry dropper, or on the behind a dry fly, in like a double dry fly rig. Or you could even go ahead and just sink the RS2 and fish them deep as well. They're very effective when fished that way. For midge adults, I really like the Griffiths Gnat in a size 18 to 22, because that imitates those clusters of midges that I was talking about. And it just looks buggy. The Griffiths Gnat it's got that peacock herl body, and there's something about peacock herl that makes fish go nuts. They just kind of lose their inhibition, and they go after them. I think it's part of the reason that the Prince Nymph is such an effective fly, because the body's all peacock herl. Same thing with the Griffiths Gnat. And then a Matt's midge in sizes 18 to 22 works great as well, especially if you're in a place where the fish are eating single midge adults, or they're just being a little bit pickier. The Griffiths Gnat, when you really take a look at it, doesn't look a whole lot like a fly, but the Matt's midge really dials in size, shape, and color of the midge adults, so it's very effective if they're being a little bit pickier. And then a size 20 Parachute Adams is also another sneaky good fly to use to imitate midge adults if you need it to. I've been in plenty of situations where I didn't have my Griffiths Gnats. I was out of Matt's midges, and all I had were really small Parachute Adams. So I tied those on, and I was able to do just fine. Even though they've got the tail on them, I don't know if the fish particularly care. Maybe they think it's the trailing shuck of an emerger or something, but they tend to work pretty well in midge hatches sometimes. So that wraps up all the patterns, and that actually wraps up all the midge talk today. So if you learned something new, or you've got another question about midges, go ahead and drop that in the comments. Love to see the discussion that y'all are going to have. But we're going to move on from the main part of the show into the Q&A section of this week's show. Every week, we spend half of Untangled directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there's a link to send those in down in the show notes, or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Our first question this week comes to us from Sean from Alberta, writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, big fan of the show. I'm an intermediate fly fisher and am regularly taking friends who are beginners out to the river. Your tips have really helped me appear as a more competent fly fisher when trying to teach them. My question is around hatches. I have never been on a river when a hatch is on. What is the best time of day or conditions for a hatch to take off? Any tips or podcast episodes I should go back to? Thanks, and tight lines." Sean, it's a good question, and thank you for the kind words. Appreciate it. So hatches are largely going to be dependent on the time of year and then the water temperature. So midges, for example, since we talked about them for the start of the show, they're going to hatch year-round, but their best hatches when they're at the most active is when the water hits about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. From there on up to, I think their range is in the 60s. Don't quote me on that, but I know when the water hits about 42 is when they really start going. But this is all going to vary when the water hits that threshold, for example. That's all going to vary widely based on your region. Up in Canada, you're probably a few weeks behind me, at least a few weeks behind me here in Wyoming. So when I see the first good mayfly hatches of spring, for example, you're probably going to have to wait a bit longer for things to warm up and kick in gear that much further north. It might be 2 weeks, might be 3 weeks, really kind of just depends on the year, but being that much further north, it's probably pretty likely you're just a smidge behind me. So on the micro scale, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get a solid idea of when certain hatches are supposed to happen in your neck of the woods. Again, our year-round hatch chart lays out a general guideline for that, but things are different depending on where you live. So things might be off by a couple of weeks. We talk about that in the hatch chart. So again, if you haven't grabbed it, there's a link in the show notes to grab a copy of it. It's very, very helpful. And then just to give you an example, right? Here in Wyoming, I know that I can count on the salmon fly hatch in mid-June, and the golden stoneflies will really take off the second week of July. It's almost like clockwork. I can count on that now. Our best blue wing olive hatches tend to be in mid-April through May. And that holds true for a lot of our fisheries here. Once you have that general idea of when a hatch should happen, you've got that time frame, then you've got to focus on the macro, which is exactly when. So not just general, but let's dial in on the exactly when. So for example, your blue-winged olives, when they come off in the early spring, the first hatches of the year, they tend to come off the strongest, the thickest from about 11 a.m. to around 3 or 4 p.m. on, I think, just about every fishery that I've fished here in the lower 48. That's their time frame that they really seem to be the most active. So that would be the time you would want to head to the river for that blue-winged olive hatch. Stoneflies love hot weather. They love sunny days. So as soon as it warms up in the mornings, they're going to be crawling around. They're going to be active and moving during the hottest part of the day. Caddis are really big fans of low light. So they're going to be most active early and late in the day, and then along with your midges and your summer mayflies like your pale morning duns and your tricos. They're all going to love those low light periods. So right now, being that it is late summer, I would focus on, well, it's not quite late summer, is it? Midsummer. Anyways, I would still focus on the early mornings and the late evenings because you should have some great caddis and midge hatches at a bare minimum on your rivers. You should be able to find those two. So early mornings, late evenings, that's when I would focus on being out and upping your chances of getting into that hatch where the river's alive with fish. But as a general rule, the hatches are almost always going to be best in that early morning and late evening, with the exception of stoneflies and then those early spring mayflies. That's when I would focus my efforts if I wanted to get into one of those hatches where it feels like the river's boiling with fish. But the caveat here is, as with a lot of things in fly fishing, there is an element of luck into getting into these hatches. Everything can line up and you can think this is going to be the perfect day. And then they just don't come off for whatever reason. They just don't happen. How long ago was it? 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was out fishing and I met Alex. I met him middle of the day somewhere and he'd fished that morning. And he told me about this amazing pale morning dun hatch that happened super early that morning. And he was stoked because we had the next morning to fish. So we got up really early the next morning. We got on the water. We rode down to where we wanted to be and there were no bugs. There was a little bit of a storm moving in, so that changed things quite a bit, but it was overcast, it was low light, the water temperature was the same, a lot of the variables were the same, and they just didn't come off for whatever reason. So stuff like that's going to happen where all those conditions line up and they just don't come off. So if that happens, don't beat yourself up over it. Just keep putting yourself in situations when there's supposed to be a hatch, and eventually you're going to get into it. And then sometimes you'll just get lucky too. A couple of weeks ago, I got home. We'd been down in Utah with our daughter, and she was in the NICU for a while. So we were down there with her, and we finally got home. And a couple of days after we got home, I went out fishing, and it was middle of the afternoon. I didn't really have any hope of getting much. I just needed to spend some time on the water. And I pull up to the local creek, get down there, and there's this green drake hatch that I could not believe, just going nuts on the water for like 3 or 4 hours. And I told my wife, I said, I'll be home by 6. And it was 5:30 and it's a half-hour drive home. And the bugs were still going. And I really didn't want to leave. But with a newborn, it always not when you want to test the boundaries of when you tell your spouse you're going to be home. So I left. But I just got into that amazing hatch, just stumbled right into it. And that'll happen. The more and more you get out and fish, sometimes it'll happen. But focus on those early morning, late evening times. Be out on the water when there's supposed to be bugs active. Do the research to figure out the trends in your area, and you're going to set yourself up for a lot of success. So I appreciate the question. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. Victoria from Connecticut has our next question, writes in and says, I've been attempting to fish smaller, heavily wooded streams here in Connecticut where the flows and depth vary greatly with plenty of obstacles. Any advice on how to fish these types of waters, what flies to use, and how to minimize spooking fish? Thanks. Love this podcast. It's been really helpful starting up my fly fishing. Victoria, great question, and thank you for the kind words. I do appreciate them. Let me answer the flies question first. We get questions like that all the time. It's, I fish such and such type of water. What flies should I use? Use the flies that imitate the bugs that are hatching. There's no such thing as a small stream fly and a big river fly or a brown trout fly and a rainbow trout fly. There's just insects that the bugs are eating. And that's a very important distinction to make because it's easy to assume that's the case, but it's just, what are they eating? Okay. Match what you see on the water, match those real bugs to the fake ones in your box, based on size. That's the most important. Shape is the next most important. And then color is the least important. So if you see a bunch of long, skinny-ish looking bugs that are a little bit gray, they might be a mayfly. So you're going to tie on a parachute Adams because it's long, it's skinny, it's kind of dark, just like those ones. You're going to match those to the fake bugs in your box to the real life ones that you're seeing out there on the water. You don't have to know their names. You just have to be able to watch and wait for a minute, observe a little bit, and then match what you've got in your box again to the real life bugs that you're seeing. So that's what I would recommend for fly choice. Don't overthink it. Just go with stuff that should be active. Right now, it's really hard to go wrong with caddis, midges, and mayflies. Even out in Connecticut, you're still going to see that. All right. Now, the kind of small stream fishing that you're describing really sounds to me like it's tailor-made for the dry dropper rig, which we just did a podcast about that. I think it was 2 weeks ago, all about the dry dropper rig. This is just a rig that's got a dry fly up on top, and then it's got a nymph underneath it, so you're able to hit 2 parts of the water column at once. And even though you're telling me that the depth on the river varies quite a bit from hole to hole, what you can do is if you set the depth of your nymph to about 1.5 times the average depth of the hole on the river. So if a lot of the holes tend to be like 3-ish feet deep and you set yours like 4.5 feet deep, I did that wrong. Let's go with like 2 feet deep and you set yours like 3.5 feet deep, or even just 3 feet deep. Then you're going to be able to fish a lot of water very effectively with that dry dropper rig. You don't have to worry about dialing in the depth precisely on these small streams because the fish tend to be a lot more opportunistic and they'll move a little bit further to eat. Now, if you're not getting takes, that's when I would really try to dial in the depth. But to start out, that dry dropper rig with a nymph about 1.5 times the depth of what you're fishing, and you should be in good shape. So that's the rig. That's how I would approach it. But the key in this kind of water to being effective with it is you got to keep your casting to a minimum because you've not only got to fight the brush, but you've also got to keep drag from yanking your flies out of these small pockets because usually the pockets are so much smaller. You've got a much shorter time for them to drift that you really want to make sure you're not getting any drag. So you're going to keep your casting to a minimum, and then you're also going to employ high sticking, which is a technique where you cast your flies out and then you lift as much of the line and leader and tippet off the water as possible so that just your fly and the bare minimum amount of leader is drifting on the water. And that'll eliminate a lot of drag, especially in these tight little pockets. It's a very, very easy technique, but a very, very valuable technique for this kind of fishing. As far as minimizing spooking the fish, a lot of that's really going to depend on the particular stream itself. So on my local stream, the water is so turbulent that I can get really close to the holes because the fish can't see me with all that foam everywhere. Even though the water is pretty clear, it works out. But on your stream, if the water is not as turbulent, if it's crystal clear, you're going to want to stick to the banks if that's at all possible so that you avoid getting in and causing a lot of noise with your wading. Or you're going to have to make some longer casts if it's not so overgrown that you can't do that. One thing that helps me sometimes in situations like this is actually using a lot longer leader instead of a shorter one. So what I'll do is I'll tie on a few extra feet of tippet. So I've got like an 11 or 12 foot leader instead. And then I'll just have a few feet of fly line out the tip of my rod. Now what that does is it loads the rod with just enough energy that I can cast mostly leader and then the flies. And just that little bit of fly line out gives me the weight I need to have some control over that. But then I'm mostly casting leader and tippet. So I'm getting very soft, very subtle presentations. I don't have fly line slapping the water, potentially spooking fish. The only downside is that's not as accurate a way to fish. It can take a little bit of getting used to because you're not loading the rod the typical way that you would if you were making proper long casts, but it is a very effective way to fish. Another couple of things to bear in mind is trying to sneak up from behind the fish. Make sure you're fishing upstream because fish have great eyesight. If you're fishing downstream, especially a small stuff that's super clear, they're going to see you and spook very quickly. So make sure you're moving your way upstream if that's possible. And then again, make sure you're staying low because fish have wonderful eyesight. So if you're really tall, if you're the tallest thing on the horizon, the fish are going to see that and they're going to interpret that as a threat, and they're not really going to be that interested in eating your flies. So crouching, kneeling, sometimes even army crawling is required. Excuse me. It'll really help you to spook fish less. So hopefully that answers your questions, Victoria. If you've got any more follow-ups or if anybody else has tips for her, please drop those in the comments. Thank you. Grady from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, how do I get more confidence while wading? How do I know if I can get in and walk up the stream or not? I feel so unconfident that I usually stick to the banks, but that makes it hard to access the water I want to. Do you usually spend your time wading or walking the bank? Just trying to get my expectations correct and learn more about how to approach the water. Thanks. Grady, yeah, I usually spend my time in the water. I will get out and walk the banks if I'm moving from spot to spot or if I want to skip a lot of water that's marginal, doesn't look like it holds a lot of fish. I'll go ahead and do that. But I'm in the water pretty frequently because usually you get a better angle on your cast when you're in the water. I'll give you an example. If you're walking up the river and you see a fish rising on the opposite bank, you're almost always going to get a better presentation if you can get in the river and either get directly underneath that fish or at the very least make a quartering upstream cast to that fish. It's going to work out a lot better for you than if you stand on the bank and try and cast directly across all of those currents because you've got so much drag to deal with. You might not even have enough room on the bank for a back cast. So getting into the water, being comfortable in the water is definitely a skill that's got to be developed. And the best way to do that is just to get out and do it as often as you can. But of course, comes with the caveat of make sure that you're safe while you're doing it. Don't want anybody to hurt themselves. And just to revisit a little point I made, I didn't realize this until last year, but we shot this video where we took my mother-in-law out fly fishing, and she'd never been fly fishing before. We filmed the whole thing, actually. It's kind of interesting. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll throw a link in the show notes, or I'll throw one up here on the screen too if you're watching the video podcast. But something that she said that day really stuck out to me, because Alex and I were filming, we're guiding, we're walking through the river, trying to help her get into fish. And we're walking through the river like it's nothing. And it wasn't a particularly challenging river, but it wasn't easy either. And my mother-in-law struggled with it. And she even commented, "Why is it so easy for you guys to walk through the river?" And it really kind of hit me that, wow, wading is as much of a skill as anything else. It's something that you do need to practice. If you want to get better at it, it's a skill that you will develop the more and more that you do it. Now, that being said, you don't just go out there and stumble and go for a swim, because that's not always fun, and it's certainly not always safe. So the biggest thing that made the difference for me with my wading was learning how to position myself so that I felt stable in the water. Now, I've got awful balance. I would suck at American Ninja Warrior. So when I'm wading, I take a much wider stance, and I like to face slightly upstream. I found that makes me feel a bit more stable when I'm wading. I don't feel as off my game when I do that. I also make sure to never cross my feet while wading. That's a recipe for tripping and falling in. So if you're trying to walk across the river the same way you walk normally, I've found that to be problematic for myself. So instead, what I do is I keep my feet moving in the same line. It's almost kind of like a shuffle. I never place them in front of each other like you do when you walk along the banks, unless it's very mild or very flat wading. Then at that point, you kind of default. But if there's any kind of current, or there's a really unstable river bottom that might throw me off my game, that's when I'm going to be very, very cautious, make sure I don't cross my feet. And then the last thing is I do take things pretty slow. Alex, he's a much, much faster wader than I am. He'll cross deep, fast water in like half the time it takes me. And I used to be really self-conscious about that. It used to bother me a little bit. And, part of it is I'm out of shape. I'm a little bit overweight. So, yeah, he's going to beat me on that stuff too. But I've also just learned that it's how I effectively wade rivers. I'm just a little bit slower. I really don't take a second step until I feel firm and solid in my footing, and I like where I'm currently standing. So those things helped me. The one other thing I would mention too is learning how to read where to cross. If you can stand behind some boulders, you can get behind in those pockets and stuff. That can be really helpful. It's a good place to rest if you need to catch your breath in the middle of the river, if you can get to a pocket. But again, this all comes with time on the water. So you've got to take that step. You've got to take that plunge if you really want to get better at it. So if you're really concerned, I would recommend getting a wading staff. Probably would not be a bad investment at all. It's just a fancy walking stick that's designed to use while you're wading the rivers. And then last thing, I have found that good wading boots make an absolute world of difference. Because if your feet are stable and you've got good grip, it's going to feel like a whole new world out there. You will feel like a brand new person if you do that. I'm currently wearing the Squala RS boots. They're the best wading boots that I've ever worn. I highly recommend them, especially if you're concerned about being stable out there on the water. So I appreciate that question so much. And with that, folks, we are going to move on to the Live Your Life moment of this week's show. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from listeners and viewers just like yourselves. I love to see and hear about all the adventures y'all are going on, so keep sending these Live Your Life moments in. They're fantastic. It's a great way to connect with y'all, and I think we all enjoy hearing and seeing these stories come to life. So if you've got a Live Your Life moment that you would like to share, there is a link to send those in down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Your Life moment is from Ewan. Writes in and says, "Over the summer, I started fly fishing after I watched a kid catch a bunch of fish while I got skunked on my spin rod. For the first few months, I had a great intro to fly fishing. I was catching tons of bluegill, then eventually catching a lot of bass. Once the cold weather hit, I stopped catching anything on my fly rod. I took countless trips to several rivers and ponds in my area, but couldn't seem to figure out what I was missing. While watching YouTube videos on fly fishing, I stumbled across VFC's channel. I spent a whole week religiously watching and reading every resource they have available. Then I ordered a fly flinger. Once my fly flinger arrived, I went to a local pond armed with my new knowledge and full of confidence courtesy of VFC. After tying on a woolly bugger and adding some small split shot, I proceeded to catch more fish than I've ever caught in a single day. I haven't looked back at bait fishing since. Thank you, VFC crew, for all the hard work y'all have put in. It's awesome to see such a kind and compassionate group of sportsmen out of my hometown. Ewan, that's awesome. I love it. Getting those first few epic days in the fly rod is unforgettable. It's a lot of fun. So thanks for sharing that with us. Love to see it. Love to hear it. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap things up this week. Thank you so much for being here. Listening to the whole show helps us out more than you'll know. So please continue to do that and tell everybody else to. Tell your grandma, tell your aunt, tell your mother-in-law, tell the crazy guy on the corner, hey, go listen to Untangled. It's going to improve your day. At a bare minimum, you're going to laugh at his dad jokes and his weird obsession with buffalo wings and Diet Coke. So, and if you could, folks, please go ahead and rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, and that's our whole goal here at VFC. That's why we do what we do. We want you to go out and have an amazing time on the water. And speaking of that, it's time for me to quit talking. So go have some fun, go catch some fish, and until next week, live real life.